Somewhere inside Kensington Palace, an employment record exists with no title attached to it, no photograph in any archive, no name that has ever appeared beside the word Diana in anything written about this year's biggest royal story. She is the reason any of it happened before the injunction. Before officers arrived at a door at 5:30 in the morning. Before William drove to Sandringham carrying a leather binder. There was a woman at a desk, looking at a photograph on a screen, deciding in 2 or 3 seconds whether to file it or make a phone call. She made the call. What happened to her afterward, nobody has ever asked. Nobody has interviewed her. Nobody has named her. The palace has never confirmed her role, and she has never claimed it. She is the one detail every account of this story requires, and every account of this story leaves out, because there was never a version of the narrative built for someone whose only action was noticing something correctly, and then doing the harder, quieter thing of telling someone who mattered. This is her story. It has to be reconstructed, because she has never told it herself, and that absence is not incidental to what follows. It is the whole of it. Picture the actual physical setting, because nobody has, and the setting explains more than any description of her motives could. A small office inside the administrative wing, the part of the palace no tourist ever photographs and no documentary ever lingers on, because it looks like every other mid-level office in the country. A desk, a monitor, a stack of physical correspondence beside a queue of digital files that need processing before the day's work can be called finished. This is not a role that comes with drama built into its job description. It is logging. It is checking that documentation matches documentation. It is the invisible administrative labor that keeps an institution the size of the British monarchy from collapsing under its own paperwork. She was processing incoming auction house correspondence. Routine. The kind of task that fills a working day without asking anything of the person for doing it beyond attention and accuracy. An image appeared. Standard catalog photography. 2 pieces of jewelry laid against a neutral background, prepared by Sotheby's for private appraisal purposes, logged under a civilian name, flagged for nothing. Most people who work inside large institutions for long enough develop a specific kind of professional numbness, not because they stop caring, but because caring about every individual piece of paper that crosses a desk is not sustainable across a 40-year career. You learn what to notice and what to let pass. You build, without realizing you are building it, an internal filter that separates the routine from the significant. Her filter caught something. Not a jolt. That is the first thing worth correcting, because every account since has implied something closer to a gasp, a hand to the mouth, a dramatic intake of breath in an otherwise quiet room. What actually happens, according to people who have spent decades working with archival material and who understand the specific texture of this kind of recognition, is quieter and stranger than that. It is closer to déjà vu than to shock. A pattern arriving before the conscious mind has finished assembling the reasons for it. You know before you know why you know. She would have seen those 2 pieces before, decades earlier, in photographs that once circulated through every newspaper in the country and half the world beyond it. Not recently. Not in any context that would make the recognition obvious or expected. Something filed deep enough in memory that its return arrived less like information and more like weather, an atmospheric shift in the room, before the specific cause of it became clear. 2 seconds, maybe 3. The gap between seeing the image and understanding what she was looking at. In that gap, she had a choice, though she would not have experienced it as a choice in the moment. File the correspondence. Move to the next item in the queue. Let the day continue exactly as it had been continuing. Unremarkable, ordinary. The kind of Tuesday nobody remembers a year later. She did not do that. She picked up the phone rather than sending an email. Sit with that decision for a moment, because it is easy to read past it as a minor procedural detail, and it is not minor at all. An email creates a record instantly, automatically, with a timestamp and a distribution list and a permanent trace that exists the moment you press send. It also creates distance. It allows the sender to compose, to consider phrasing, to soften or sharpen the message before anyone else sees it. It is the choice of someone managing how something will be received. A phone call requires the other person to answer in real time, requires you to explain, out loud, in your own voice, something you are not yet fully certain how to explain. It carries risk that an email does not carry. If you are wrong, if you have misread the image, if this turns out to be nothing, You have said so out loud to another human being who will remember that you said it. She called anyway. Nobody has recorded what she actually said in that first conversation. There is no transcript, no memo, no official record of the specific words used to describe what she had seen. What exists is only the consequence. Within minutes, the image had reached people who understood immediately what she had understood only slightly before them. Within the hour, the atmosphere inside Kensington Palace had shifted entirely. She had already gone back to her desk by then, back to the queue of correspondence still waiting to be processed, back to the ordinary shape of her working day, while several floors and several conversations away, the thing she had set in motion was already moving faster than she could have tracked, even if anyone had thought to keep her informed. Here is what did not happen next, and the absence matters as much as anything that did. Nobody came to thank her personally. There is no account anywhere of William or his legal team, or anyone senior in the palace's communication structure, seeking her out afterward to acknowledge that her attention, her memory, her decision to make a phone call rather than let a routine document pass through unremarked was the single origin point of everything that followed. This is not necessarily cruelty. It may simply be how large institutions function under pressure, moving forward at speed toward the next urgent task without pausing to formally recognize the person who supplied the initial spark. Everyone above her in that structure had, within hours, an enormous amount to manage: legal strategy, financial exposure, the delicate question of how to approach the king, the operational complexity of an injunction that needed to be filed with total secrecy and total speed. In that context, the woman at the desk who made the phone call becomes, almost immediately, a footnote to her own discovery. But footnotes are still real. They still happened. And the fact that an institution moves too quickly to pause and acknowledge someone does not mean that person experienced the moving past as neutral. She went home that evening, presumably, the way she goes home every evening. She did not appear at any press conference. She was not named in William's statement about the Diana Heritage Trust. She was not interviewed by Bloomberg or the Wall Street Journal when they began tracking the unusual financial movements that her single phone call had ultimately triggered. She simply continued doing the job she had been doing before any of this started: processing correspondence, checking documentation, filing what needed to be filed in an office that looks like every other administrative office in the country. There is a version of this story where she does something else entirely, and it is worth naming that version specifically, because everything she chose not to do tells you as much about her as anything she actually did. She did not sell the story. Consider what 2 pieces of Diana's missing jewelry, surfacing under a civilian name at a major London auction house, would have been worth to any tabloid in the country had she chosen to leak it herself rather than escalate it internally. Consider the specific enormous financial value of being the source, the person quoted anonymously as a palace insider in a story that would have run on front pages across multiple continents within a single news cycle. She had exactly the kind of information that turns anonymous administrative staff into paid sources overnight. She had it before anyone senior in the palace knew it existed. She could have called a journalist instead of calling internally, and no one would ever have been able to prove where the leak originated. She did not do that either. Not because the thought never occurred to her. We cannot know that, and it would be dishonest to claim certainty about the internal experience of someone who has never spoken about any of this. But the record of her actual behavior, the only evidence available, shows a person who identified something significant and routed it through the correct internal channel, at cost to herself and at no financial benefit whatsoever, in an act of institutional loyalty that has never once been publicly credited. That is not a small thing. That is the entire moral center of gravity this story actually turns on, and almost nobody who covered the surrounding events noticed it was there. There is a specific kind of quiet damage that comes from doing the right thing inside a system that will never acknowledge you did it. Not damage in any dramatic sense. Nobody investigated her. Nobody punished her. Her job, presumably, continued exactly as it had before. The same desk, the same queue of correspondence, the same unremarkable Tuesdays stacking into unremarkable Wednesdays. But something happened to her understanding of her own position inside that institution, something that never gets discussed because it produces no headline and no photograph. She discovered, in the aftermath of her own consequential action, that being the person who starts something and being the person who gets credit for it are two entirely separate categories of experience, and that the institution she worked for was fully capable of using the first without ever extending the second. That is not a betrayal exactly. It may simply be how institutions of this scale and history have always operated. The visible narrative constructed around the people whose names carry weight, while the actual mechanics of how anything gets discovered, verified, and acted upon depend entirely on people whose names carry none. She would have watched, presumably, from wherever she watches news the way anyone does, as William's statement was reported internationally within hours, as commentators debated the constitutional implications of a Mareva injunction, moving at speed against a private citizen, as the Diana Heritage Trust was announced with language that framed the entire sequence of events as a triumph of institutional protection over private betrayal. Nowhere in any of that coverage was there a sentence acknowledging that none of it happens without a woman at a desk choosing, in the space of 2 or 3 seconds, to pick up a phone rather than let a photograph pass through unremarked. Here is something that sits underneath this entire story, unexamined by anyone, including, quite possibly, the woman herself. Diana spent the final years of her life being systematically unheard by the exact kind of institution this woman has spent her career serving. Told to manage her feelings quietly, told that the correct response to distress was composure rather than disclosure. Watched eventually as her own memory was folded into administrative shadow, 2 pieces of jewelry kept off the official registry for 26 years, existing nowhere that institutional memory could easily locate them. The woman who found them, who noticed what nobody else had noticed in over 2 decades, occupies almost exactly the same structural position inside that institution that Diana once occupied inside the family itself. Present, essential to how things actually function, and almost entirely unacknowledged in the official record of what happened. Nobody has connected those 2 facts publicly, and there is no evidence the woman herself has ever framed her own experience this way. But the shape is there whether or not anyone names it. A woman noticing something true, communicating it correctly through the only channel available to her, and then disappearing from the story that her noticing made possible. Diana's jewelry came home. The person who found it did not. Somewhere inside the palace's internal records, there almost certainly exists a document logging the original report. Institutions of this size do not function on verbal history alone. Somewhere, in a file that has never been made public, and likely never will be, there is a timestamp, a name, possibly a brief description of the call that started everything. That document has never been requested by any journalist covering this story, because none of them knew to ask for it. It sits, presumably, exactly where administrative documents sit inside large institutions, filed correctly, accessible to the people who need to access it, invisible to everyone else. Think about what that document actually contains. If it exists in the form it likely exists in. Not drama. Not a dramatic reconstruction of a woman's internal experience recognizing something significant. A timestamp. A brief factual note. The bureaucratic residue of what was, for her, presumably one of the more unusual moments of an otherwise ordinary working life, reduced to the flattest possible institutional language. Because that is what institutional documents do to human experience. They compress it until nothing remains except the fact of its having occurred. That compression is not malicious. It is simply what happens to almost everything that passes through a bureaucracy, large enough to require documentation of its own daily functioning. But it means that somewhere permanently, the only official record of the moment that made this entire story possible exists as a line item in a file. Nobody outside a small circle of administrators will ever read. Everything else about this story has been narrated, reconstructed, analyzed from a dozen angles by people with no direct knowledge of what actually happened in that first phone call. The one document that might actually describe it accurately sits unread, uncited, and almost certainly will remain that way. There is a specific kind of knowledge that comes from spending years inside an institution's paperwork rather than its public-facing rooms. And it is worth taking seriously as its own form of expertise, distinct from and in some ways more valuable than anything a legal team or a communications office provides. The people who eventually built the case against Laura Lopes, who constructed the Mareva injunction, who drafted the letter's patent William carried to Sandringham were working with information that had already been identified, verified, and escalated before any of them became involved. Their expertise was legal and constitutional. Hers was something else entirely. The accumulated, unglamorous knowledge of what belongs where, what has always belonged where, what looks slightly wrong against a backdrop of thousands of items that mostly look exactly right. That kind of knowledge does not come from a law degree. It comes from years of unremarkable attention to unremarkable detail, the specific competence of someone who has spent long enough inside an institution's actual operational texture that they can recognize, almost instinctively, when something has drifted out of its correct place. Nobody built a legal case honoring that kind of expertise, because the legal system has no mechanism for honoring it. It has mechanisms for injunctions, for search warrants, for the freezing of financial accounts. It has no mechanism for acknowledging the person whose quiet, accumulated competence made the entire legal process possible in the first place. We do not know what she would say if she ever spoke publicly about any of this, and it would be dishonest to construct her voice for her. To imagine specific sentences and attribute them to a person who has chosen, so far, complete silence. But it is possible to sit with the shape of what she might be carrying without inventing the specifics of how she would describe it. She might feel pride, quiet and entirely private, at having done something genuinely consequential inside an institution that rarely allows people in her position to feel that their work matters beyond its immediate administrative function. She might feel something closer to resignation, an acceptance that this is simply how the institution operates, and always has, that credit flows upward and accountability flows downward, and that expecting anything else would be its own kind of naivety. She might feel nothing at all resembling either of those things. She might have already moved entirely past this, filed it internally the way she files everything else, a significant event in an otherwise ordinary career that she thinks about rarely, if at all. The honest answer is that nobody knows, and the not knowing is not a failure of research. It is the actual condition of her existence inside this story. She has been permitted no interior life in any account of these events, because no account of these events was ever built to include her. On the day William released his statement about the Diana Heritage Trust, on the day the palace's careful, measured paragraph about legacy and boundaries traveled internationally within hours, she was presumably at her desk. Nobody has confirmed this. There is no photograph of her watching the news that day, no interview describing what it felt like to see the consequences of her own phone call finally reach their public conclusion. But the timeline suggests it. The ordinary continuation of an ordinary working life, running in parallel to the extraordinary public resolution of something she had quietly set in motion months earlier. She would have read the same statement everyone else read, watched the same coverage, seen Catherine's bracelet photographed at a public engagement weeks later. The quiet symbolic conclusion of an argument she had never been publicly connected to and would never be publicly connected to. If she felt anything watching that unfold, recognition, satisfaction, a private and unspoken understanding that none of it happens without her. There is no record of it. There will likely never be a record of it. She has become, in the only story that will ever be told about this sequence of events, a structural necessity with no name attached, the phone call itself surviving in the historical record, while the person who made it does not. This is not, it turns out, an unusual story inside institutions of this scale. It is close to the default pattern. Somewhere behind every major institutional discovery, every scandal uncovered, every piece of missing history recovered and restored to its correct place, there is very often a person occupying exactly this position. Not the lawyer who builds the case, not the executive who announces the resolution. The person several layers down, doing unglamorous, unremarkable work, who happens to notice the thing that everyone above them will eventually take credit for having addressed. Journalism has a name for this pattern. When it involves corporate whistleblowers, though even then, the credit is often unevenly distributed and the personal cost frequently exceeds any recognition eventually granted. Royal reporting has developed no equivalent vocabulary at all, because the entire genre depends on maintaining a small cast of recognizable figures: the king, the prince, the princess, the various consorts and heirs, whose actions can be tracked, quoted, and dramatized. There is no room in that established cast for an administrative employee whose single phone call happened to be the origin point of everything else. She does not fit the genre. That is, in the end, the simplest explanation for why she has been left out of every account of this story, including, until now, this one. There is no legal mechanism through which she could claim anything from what happened. She has no ownership stake in the recovered jewelry, no entitlement to any portion of the frozen accounts eventually released, no formal recognition process through which her role could be acknowledged, even if someone senior wanted to acknowledge it. What she has, presumably, is the private knowledge of what she did, and whatever internal accounting she has made with herself about whether that private knowledge is sufficient compensation for the fact that it will never become public knowledge. Some people would find that sufficient. Doing the right thing quietly, without needing the world to confirm that it happened, is its own kind of integrity, arguably a more demanding kind than doing the right thing loudly, in front of an audience that will reward you for it. Other people would find it corrosive over time, the slow accumulation of unacknowledged, significant moments producing, eventually, something closer to invisibility as a permanent condition rather than a temporary circumstance. The specific loneliness of having done something that mattered enormously to other people's lives while remaining, in every account of what happened, a ghost in your own story. We do not know which of those two experiences she is actually living inside. We do not know if she thinks about any of this at all, or if it has already receded into the ordinary texture of a working life that continues, unremarkably, exactly as it did before any of this started. Here's what remains once everything else about this story has been told and retold and reduced to its most shareable, most satisfying version. William recovered 2 pieces of his mother's jewelry because a woman at a desk noticed something correctly and chose, in 2 or 3 seconds, to make a phone call rather than let a photograph pass through unremarked. Everything else, the legal machinery, the injunction, the raid, the trust, the bracelet photographed at a public engagement weeks later, follows directly from that single unwitnessed choice. She has never been named. She has never been interviewed. She has never claimed credit, sold the story, or in any way suggested that she understands her own role to be significant. Whatever she carries about this, pride, resignation, nothing at all, remains entirely private, unrecorded, and very likely permanent. The institution she serves has built an elaborate, legally sound, symbolically resonant structure to ensure that nothing belonging to Diana can ever again disappear into administrative shadow the way those 2 pieces disappeared for 26 years. It has built no equivalent structure to ensure that the people who notice things correctly, who make the phone call instead of letting the moment pass, are ever remembered for having done so. Somewhere inside Kensington Palace, at a desk that looks like every other desk in that administrative wing, a woman is doing today whatever she did yesterday, and whatever she will do tomorrow, entirely unaware, perhaps, that anyone outside a small circle of people who were never asked to speak about her is still thinking about the 2 or 3 seconds when she looked at a photograph and understood, before she could have explained why, that she was looking at something that needed to come home.